What if the quietest woman on a plane held more power than anyone else on board? A pregnant black passenger boards first class, gets dismissed, touched without consent, and stays silent. But not because she's afraid. Who is she really? And what happens when silence speaks louder than justice itself? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Zelina Moore stood at the VIP check-in counter of Nova Wings Aviation inside Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Her black maternity dress hung loosely over her 8-month belly, and her ankles were starting to swell. Still, she carried herself with a calm, collected dignity, shoulders back, lips pressed together in quiet reserve. She wore no jewelry, no makeup, no signs that screamed for attention. Just a woman, tired but composed, traveling alone. The check-in agent glanced at her, then at the ticket. Something shifted in his posture. He took a moment longer than necessary, scanning the barcode, glancing again at her name on the screen. "You're flying first class?" he asked, not unkindly, but with a thin thread of doubt in his voice. Selena smiled faintly, the kind of smile that told people she was used to moments like this. "Yes." The agent's fingers clicked across the keyboard again. A pause. Then he gave a tight smile and handed her the boarding pass. "Gate C-18, boarding in 45 minutes. Have a good flight." She accepted the pass with a nod. "Thank you." And that was it. No fight, no reaction. Just a quiet note in her mind, added to a collection of similar moments. In the VIP lounge, everything was spotless and muted. Soft jazz played through overhead speakers. The plush chairs were filled with business suits, expensive handbags, and the familiar rustle of printed newspapers. Selena stepped in, and instantly she felt it. That momentary ripple in the air when someone doesn't quite belong. Two men in tailored blazers exchanged glances over their coffee. A woman in heels shifted her purse to the seat beside her, a subtle move, as if making sure Zelina didn't sit too close. No one said a word, but their eyes spoke plenty. Zelina didn't flinch. She scanned the room and found a seat in the far corner. On her way there, an older janitor passed her in the aisle, pushing a quiet mop cart. Their eyes met. He gave her a warm, brief smile. She returned it, and in that smile was something unspoken. Acknowledgement, kindness, a kind of solidarity only shared between those who felt invisible before. She lowered herself gently into the seat, one hand resting on her belly. The baby kicked softly. She whispered almost to herself, "Just get us there safe. That's all we need." Her mind drifted to Thane. She pictured his hand on hers the night before she left. "I booked first class," he had said, brushing her cheek with his thumb. "You deserve more than that, but it's a start." She had smiled, tired and grateful. Thane always saw her, really saw her. Still, a small knot of anxiety sat in her chest. She didn't fear turbulence or the plane itself. What she feared was that her child might be born into a world where her mother would always be questioned for simply being present. When the boarding announcement called for first-class passengers, Zelina rose carefully. Her gate was at the far end, and by the time she reached it, most of the other first-class passengers had already boarded. The jet bridge was quiet. Inside the plane, the lighting was warm. The air smelled like lemon-scented polish and faint leather. As she stepped through the cabin doors, a woman in a crisp uniform stepped in front of her, blonde in her early 40s, badge reading L. Brewster. "Ma'am," the woman said, holding out her hand. "Can I see your ticket?" Selena handed it over, wordless. Lana Brewster's eyes flicked between the ticket and Zelina's face. Her mouth pressed into a flat line. "This is for seat 2A. "Yes," Zelina replied softly. A few long seconds passed before Lana nodded and stepped aside. She didn't smile, didn't say welcome. Just a sharp exhale through the nose, then turned her attention back to the galley. Zelina made her way to her seat. It took effort, her hips ached, and she moved slower than usual. When she finally lowered herself into the wide leather chair, she reached for the seatbelt. It sat tucked awkwardly under her belly. She pressed the call button, hoping for assistance. Lana walked by. She glanced at Zelina, registered the lit button, and kept walking. No words, no explanation. Zelina stared after her, blinking. A man across the aisle noticed. He hesitated for a second, looked toward Lana, then quickly returned to his tablet. That was the thing about this kind of moment. It always happened in plain sight, but rarely did anyone feel like it was their place to intervene. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and tapped a single message. Something happened. I'm okay. Please monitor Flight NW214. She hit send. The phone slid back into her purse, and she folded her hands over her stomach. Her eyes drifted to the window. Outside, the lights on the tarmac shimmered through the heat waves. The engines hummed in the background. Zelina sat still, but something in the air had shifted. It was too quiet, too composed, and she wasn't just any passenger. The cabin lights had dimmed to a warm amber as Zelina tried again to pull the seatbelt across her belly. It wasn't just tight, it was poorly positioned for someone her size and shape at this stage. She twisted slightly, adjusting herself in the seat, but the strap still pressed awkwardly against her lower abdomen. She paused, took a breath, and tried not to let frustration rise. To her left, a man in his 50s, wearing a slate gray blazer, shifted slightly away from her. She hadn't touched him, hadn't said a word, but his body moved like hers was a threat he needed distance from. He didn't look at her, just lifted his phone and scrolled as if tuning her out was second nature. The soft piano music flowing through the cabin speakers only made the silence more pronounced. The clink of a spoon in a porcelain cup, a hushed laugh from somewhere up front. Everything carried that filtered hush you only find in places where people believe they've bought a certain kind of peace. Zelina didn't say a word. She didn't press the call button again. Instead, she leaned back slightly, resting one hand over the curve of her stomach. The baby shifted, a quiet ripple inside her. She breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. You've done this before, she reminded herself. The stares, the assumptions, the space people made as though your very presence made them uncomfortable. This wasn't new. It just wore a little heavier now. Her thoughts drifted, uninvited, to those early days in the hospital. Back when COVID was at its worst, when everything smelled like antiseptic and desperation. She'd been in her third 12-hour shift in a row when an older white man in ICU started crashing. The attending doctor had panicked, but she, Zelina, had kept her cool, stabilized him, repositioned the mask, got him breathing again. Later, that same doctor pulled her aside and said, "You're too good for this floor. You should be teaching, leading, not here." Then he hesitated. "But you know how things are. Some rooms just aren't ready for people like you." It wasn't said with cruelty, but it cut anyway. She remembered standing in the stairwell later that night, trying to shake the words off like they were dust. She remembered thinking, maybe it's time to stop asking for space. Maybe it's time to build your own. Now here she was, in a leather seat that cost more than most people's rent, still being quietly pushed to the margins. A soft voice brought her back. "Ma'am, do you need help with that?" Zelina looked up. A young flight attendant stood beside her, short, slim, black hair pinned neatly into a bun. Her name tag read Maribel Chen. Zelina nodded slightly, motioning toward the belt. "It's just not sitting right." Without hesitation or commentary, Maribel leaned in and gently adjusted the strap. Her fingers worked quickly, respectfully. Not once did her expression change into pity or irritation. "There," Maribel said. "Let me know if it needs adjusting again, okay?" Zelina managed a faint smile. "Thank you." Maribel hesitated for just a second, then glanced around as if checking for listening ears. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm sorry. About the earlier moment. We're under a lot of pressure today." Her tone wasn't defensive. It was tired, honest. She didn't linger. She simply gave a quick nod and turned to head back down the aisle. Zelina watched her go. Something about the way she moved, efficient, alert, cautious, felt familiar. Like someone who knew the rules but also knew when they needed breaking. Near the galley, Maribel slowed and spoke quietly to another attendant, a tall man stocking bottled water into a drawer. "I think I know who she is," she said, not quite whispering. He looked over his shoulder. "Who?" Maribel glanced back toward 2A. "That lady. Seat 2A. She looks like someone I saw during the pandemic. On a panel or something. A speaker. Or maybe in the news? You sure? He asked. No, she said. And I probably shouldn't say anything more. Zelina couldn't hear the words, but she saw the look. The curious one people gave when they realized they might be in the presence of someone who mattered, but hadn't quite figured out why. As Maribel disappeared into the back, another figure approached. Lana Brewster. The lead attendant strode past without a word, but not without a glare. Her eyes landed briefly on Maribel, narrow and sharp. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. A woman 2 rows behind Zelina leaned over to her husband and whispered, "Feels like something else is going on." He shrugged, but his eyes didn't leave Zelina. Nobody said what they were all thinking, not out loud. But a current had shifted, and for the first time since she boarded the plane, Zelina felt something ripple in the air. Like truth had quietly stepped into the room, and no one quite knew what to do with it yet. The plane hadn't moved in nearly 20 minutes. The engines were quiet, no rumble, no whir of preparation. Outside the small oval windows, the runway lights blinked faintly, waiting for a signal that wasn't coming. Inside, no one was speaking above a whisper. The usual rustling of carry-ons and soft clinks of glassware had faded. People were beginning to notice something wasn't right. Zelina sat still, her right hand resting on the gentle rise of her belly. Her eyes were closed, not in sleep, but in something close to focus. Her breathing was steady, unhurried. She was listening, not to the plane, but to herself. There was a strange calm inside her, not numbness, not peace, just a knowing. Something was shifting, something larger than discomfort or bruised pride. She didn't want a scene. She didn't want to be the story. But sometimes the story found you anyway. Down the aisle, Lana moved faster than usual, stepping into the galley and shutting the small storage door behind her with more force than necessary. Her voice was low but strained as she spoke into her headset. "I don't know what's going on," she said, clearly rattled. "There's this woman, passenger in 2A. Something's not right. We've got a delay, but it doesn't feel mechanical. I think she might be connected, high level. Maybe someone called it in." Her breathing was faster now, her professional tone cracking. "I'm just saying, if she's got someone up top, then we're in trouble." While Lana spiraled quietly in private, Maribel moved gently through the aisle. She held a bottle of water in one hand and a small napkin in the other. Her steps were quieter than usual, her eyes softer. She stopped by Zelina's seat and leaned in slightly. "Ma'am, would you like some water?" Zelina opened her eyes. Her gaze met Maribel's, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. There was a tired kindness in Maribel's expression, the kind people show when they aren't sure if they're being brave or just too tired to stay silent anymore. Zelina gave a faint nod. Maribel handed her the bottle, then lowered her voice. "I don't know exactly what's going on," she said, "but if you need someone to speak up, I'll do it. I saw what happened." Zelina turned her head toward the window for a moment, then back to Maribel. Her voice was calm, nearly a whisper. "Truth doesn't need to be shouted," she said. "It just needs to be seen." The words hung between them, quiet but heavy. Maribel stood frozen for a breath, then gave a small nod and stepped away, her mind clearly working on something bigger than service protocol. 2 rows behind Zelina, an older man adjusted his glasses and turned his phone sideways. He tapped into a photo gallery and zoomed in on an image, a still frame from a televised event. "She looks familiar," he whispered to the woman beside him. "Remember that conference during the pandemic? The one where that nurse, what was her name? Moore something, stood in for the keynote speaker?" His wife squinted at the screen. "She looks younger there, but yes, that's her, isn't it? Dr. Zelina Moore." The whisper wasn't loud, but like all important words in a quiet room, it carried. 1 row turned to look, then another. No one spoke to her directly, but the attention had changed. It wasn't dismissal anymore. It was recognition. Zelina felt it, the shift in the air, the glances that lingered longer, the posture of the people around her beginning to change. Not relaxed, not hostile, but alert. She didn't flinch. She didn't wave them off or invite them in. She simply sat, and inside something wavered. This was the moment. The one she had feared, not because of the attention, but because it would force her to choose. Say something now, and the narrative becomes hers to manage. Say nothing, and the story writes itself. She picked up her phone again, not to dial, just to look. Her last message still sat open. No reply yet, but she hadn't expected one. Thane didn't need many words to act. That was one of the things she loved most about him. The baby moved again, a slow stretch near her left rib cage. Zelina's hand went to her belly, smoothing over the fabric. Her mind flashed through every moment where she'd chosen silence before. Not weakness, just necessity. But now, with this tiny life growing inside her, with a room full of people finally, maybe, starting to look a little deeper, she felt the weight of choice in her bones. Behind her, footsteps approached again. Not hurried, steady. The overhead speakers crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the continued delay. A team from Nova Wings Executive Operations is en route to assess and resolve a developing situation. Please remain seated. Lana, standing near the bulkhead, stiffened. Her mouth parted just slightly. Maribel down the aisle froze in place. Every eye turned toward the front. Then, one by one, they began turning toward Zelina. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. But she turned back toward the window, and for the first time since stepping onto that plane, her expression wasn't one of endurance. It was one of quiet resolve. Not the kind that waited, the kind that was ready. The cabin door clicked open, breaking the stillness like a crack of thunder in a church. 4 figures stepped in, all in dark tailored suits, the Nova Wings insignia shining discreetly on their name tags. Their presence wasn't loud, but it carried weight, like a shift in barometric pressure right before a storm. Conversation, already minimal, evaporated. Leading the group was a woman in her 50s, silver-streaked hair tied into a low chignon. Her steps were slow but steady, her eyes scanning the cabin as if measuring every square inch of air. Her name tag read, E.H. Grant, VP, Customer Integrity Division. Lana Brewster, who had been standing stiff near the galley, took a step back. I didn't do anything wrong, she stammered. Her voice, for the first time all flight, carried a tremble. There's been a misunderstanding. The VP said nothing. She didn't need to. Her gaze drifted past Lana without pause and landed directly on Zelina. Every eye followed. Zelina did not stand. She didn't speak. She simply looked up, her expression calm but unreadable. One hand rested on her belly, the other on the armrest. Her posture hadn't changed, but the air around her had. Ms. Grant walked forward and stopped 2 feet from Zelina's seat. With a subtle tilt of her head, she said softly but audibly, "Mrs. Moore, we apologize for the delay. We've been in contact with the chairman. He asked us to make sure you are properly acknowledged." A beat of silence passed, then another. The silence broke when a woman sitting a few rows back whispered, louder than she meant to, perhaps, "Mrs. Moore? Wait, isn't Thane Moore the chairman?" A younger man beside her murmured, "Yeah, that's him. Nova Wings founder, board of directors. I've seen him on Bloomberg." Suddenly, the room wasn't silent because of tension. It was silent because people were connecting dots they hadn't known existed. Zelina didn't nod, didn't correct anyone. She just held the gaze of the vice president, then gave the faintest tilt of her chin, acknowledgement, not pride. The room didn't gasp. It didn't need to. Everyone understood. Lana's shoulders slumped as the truth landed like weight on her spine. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Her hand dropped from her hip to her side. Gone was the clipped confidence. In its place stood a woman unraveling. Zelina turned slowly, not harshly, toward Lana. Her voice was level, measured. Her words for one person, but spoken aloud for everyone to hear. "You didn't know who I was, and truthfully, that's not the problem." Her voice wasn't angry. It was steady, like a river with depth. "The problem is, even if I were no one, I still deserve to be treated with dignity." Lana's lips parted, eyes blinking fast. She looked ready to speak, but no words came. Maribel, standing behind the VP, had her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her eyes shimmered, not just with nerves, something deeper. Regret, perhaps, or recognition. A man from the 3rd row slowly stood. Middle-aged, dark suit, wedding band gleaming under the cabin lights. "I saw what happened," he said, voice low but firm. "She hit her. Not hard, but not by accident. That's not how you touch a passenger." Another voice followed from behind. A woman in glasses, maybe early 60s. The tone, the disregard. It wasn't just bad service. It was something else. Something I've seen before. Then another man. And we all watched. I did too. I looked away. That's on me. The dominoes were falling. What had been silence now became momentum. One truth begetting another. The air was no longer filled with fear, but with consequence. Ms. Grant raised her hand lightly. The murmurs quieted. She turned toward Lana, her tone professional, but with an unmistakable finality. "Ms. Brewster, effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave, pending formal review. We will escort you off this flight." Lana's eyes widened. "You're suspending me. I've worked here for 15 years. This was just a misunderstanding." Before anyone could speak further, Zelina lifted her hand gently, palm open. Not to stop, but to redirect. "There's no need to humiliate her," she said quietly. "What was wrong already revealed itself. The rest is just noise." The vice president gave a subtle nod, as if accepting both the judgment and the mercy wrapped inside it. Lana stood frozen, mouth shut, eyes glassy. She didn't argue again. Zelina's gaze didn't linger on her. She turned back toward the window. Outside, the tarmac lights blinked steadily, indifferent to power or position. But inside, everything had shifted. No longer a passenger questioned. Now a mirror no one could ignore. Lana stood near the cockpit, shoulders tight, lips pressed into a thin line. Her name tag no longer held the weight it once did. The power in her voice had cracked, and now under the sterile glow of the cabin lights, she was trying to gather what little pride she had left. "You think you're better than the rest of us just because of who your husband is?" she said. The words weren't loud, but they cut through the silence like a blade through cloth. Nobody moved. Zelina remained seated for a moment, watching Lana with a stillness that unnerved more than any outburst could. Then she rose slowly, supporting herself with one hand on the armrest. She didn't move quickly. She didn't need to. Every eye in the cabin followed her. She stopped just a few feet from Lana, not invading, not intimidating, but close enough that there was no misunderstanding her intent. "I don't need you to know who I am," Zelina said, voice soft, calm, and completely without anger. "I need you to understand that you don't get to decide who deserves dignity." Lana didn't look away, but her jaw clenched and her eyes blinked too fast. A breath caught in her chest like it had nowhere to go. "I've worked for this airline for 15 years, Lana said suddenly, her voice breaking in a way no one expected. "I've followed every rule, taken double shifts, worked holidays. I've watched people come and go with less experience, less loyalty, get promoted above me." Her voice cracked again. "They all had stories, disabilities, losses, kids, causes. People listened to them. No one ever listened to me." Zelina didn't speak. She let the words hang in the air, untouched. Lana kept going, something inside her spilling open. "I didn't hate you. I saw someone else who was going to get noticed, and I was already so tired of being invisible." There it was. Not hatred, not cruelty, just a bitterness that had gone sour inside her for too long. Zelina's eyes softened, just slightly. Not with sympathy, but with understanding. "Being hurt doesn't give us the right to hurt others," she said. "You weren't invisible. You were trusted with responsibility. What you chose to do with it, that was your decision." Lana said nothing more. Her hands dropped to her sides. From the back of the cabin, footsteps approached. Maribel, shoulders drawn, stepped into view. Her eyes flicked to Lana, then to Zelina. She looked pale but resolute. "I saw everything," Maribel said. Her voice was quieter than Lana's, but more certain. "And I should have said something earlier. I froze. I told myself it wasn't my place, that it would blow over. But that's not right. Silence doesn't keep us safe. It just keeps things broken." She looked at Lana now, and her voice wavered. "I know what it's like to feel overlooked. I know what it's like to stay quiet because you don't want to be the one who makes things worse. But I think maybe not speaking up is how we let things get this far. Then she turned to Zelina, her voice nearly a whisper. I'm sorry. Zelina reached forward, laying a gentle hand over Maribel's. True kindness, she said, doesn't wait for applause. It shows up when we're most afraid. Maribel blinked fast and nodded. The cabin had grown even quieter now, as if the aircraft itself was listening. One of the senior executives, Ms. Grant, stepped closer, her expression unreadable but attentive. Mrs. Moore, she said, given the events on board, Nova Wings is prepared to offer compensation, file a formal apology, and pursue disciplinary action, should you wish. Zelina turned to her slowly, her hands folded gently over her stomach, her voice low but clear. I'm not interested in punishment, she said. That's not what this is about. Ms. Grant tilted her head, listening. I want every crew member on this flight enrolled in empathy and equity training, Zelina continued. Not just because of what happened today, but because this can't happen again to someone who doesn't have the power to respond. There was a pause. Even Ms. Grant seemed momentarily thrown off balance by the clarity of it. And I want it documented, Zelina added, so it's not forgotten once this flight lands? Ms. Grant nodded. Understood. Zelina sat down again. Her face was peaceful, not relieved, not triumphant, just at rest, like someone who had carried a stone for miles and finally set it down. Then a sound broke through, a soft clap. A little girl, no more than 7, stood near row 5 beside her mother, hands together, eyes wide with admiration. She clapped again, and then someone else joined in, and another. It wasn't a standing ovation. It wasn't loud or theatrical. It was gentle, respectful, like rain starting on dry earth. Zelina didn't cry, but her eyes grew glassy as she looked down at her belly. The baby kicked again, as if sensing the shift. There between rows of strangers and recycled air, something had changed. Not just a decision, but a beginning. No one moved. The aircraft was still grounded, but it didn't feel stuck. It felt like something sacred had just happened, and nobody wanted to be the first to break it. The hum of air vents was the only sound, yet every passenger sat suspended in that heavy, meaningful silence. Then Alyssa Grant, the vice president of customer integrity, stepped forward from the front of the cabin. Her heels clicked gently against the floor, but her presence was soft, thoughtful. She raised a hand and her voice carried, not because she spoke loudly, but because people wanted to hear her. Let's pause boarding any additional passengers, she said to the crew. Everyone stays seated. I'd like to hear from the person who matters most in this room. She turned her attention to Zelina. Zelina remained seated, her hands resting calmly over her belly. She glanced around the cabin, meeting the eyes of people who had stared at her with confusion, curiosity, even contempt, now replaced by something quieter, humility, awareness. She rose slowly, taking a steady breath. I didn't ask for this moment, she said, her voice smooth and full. I didn't come here looking for attention or drama. I was just trying to fly from one part of my life to another. She paused, let that settle. I'm not telling this story to be admired. I don't need applause. I'm speaking because I've seen what silence costs people who look like me. She looked toward Lana, whose eyes hadn't lifted from the floor. There are rules, I get that, Zelina said. But sometimes we confuse following rules with holding on to power. And power, without compassion, doesn't keep order. It causes harm. She turned back toward the passengers and executives now sitting upright, some visibly unsettled. I'm asking that this company, this industry, stop making people feel smaller for being different. Stop assuming worth comes dressed in a certain color, shape, or background. Then quietly, almost like a confession, she said, I don't hate you, Lana. I don't even blame you entirely. But I do want you to remember your eyes, your hand, your tone. They all told me I wasn't enough, and no one deserves that. Lana's eyes finally lifted. Her face looked different, less guarded, more human. I didn't mean for it to go this far, Lana said, barely audible. I really didn't. I thought I was protecting standards, keeping things professional. But maybe I was just trying to hold on to something that no longer made sense. Alyssa stepped in gently. Rules are meant to create safety, not cause injury. Today, we've all learned that intent doesn't erase impact. No one interrupted. Not a cough, not a shuffle, just the long, soft breath of people listening with their full attention. Then Zelina reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a worn, folded slip of paper. She unfolded it carefully and held it like a page from a book she knew by heart. "This was from a speech I wrote years ago," she said, "back when I was a nurse during the height of COVID." She read slowly. "If you are the last person standing in a hallway full of fear, do the right thing, even if no one sees, even if no one thanks you, because right is right, even if you stand alone." She let the words settle, then looked directly at Alyssa and the team from Nova Wings. "I hope what happened today doesn't get lost in a corporate report or buried under protocols. I hope it lives in the decisions you make tomorrow and the way you train the people who represent this name." Alyssa nodded solemnly. "Mrs. Moore, your words won't be forgotten." A few rows back, someone let out a long breath. Not frustration, release. Then came the final act. A crew member approached Lana quietly. No cuffs, no shaming, just a quiet nod of acknowledgement. Lana picked up her things. She turned slightly, pausing near Maribel, who stood beside the aisle. Maribel didn't flinch. She didn't speak first either. But as Lana passed her, Maribel said softly, "I'm not defending what you did, but I'm not going to pretend you're not still a person." Lana blinked hard, then gave a single grateful nod before walking off the aircraft. Selena watched her go, not with victory in her eyes, just stillness, the kind that follows a storm. She sat again, hands cradling her belly, eyes drifting toward the window. Somewhere outside, clearance had been granted. The plane began to taxi. But this wasn't just a flight taking off. This was something else lifting. A quiet verdict that didn't need a gavel. And just beneath her ribs, the baby kicked again. Gentle, strong. Zelina smiled. For the first time that day, she let herself feel light. By the time Zelina opened her eyes the next morning, her phone had already buzzed several times. Not from family or close friends, but from notifications, news articles, forwarded links. Her face was everywhere, but not because she wanted it to be. A headline read, "Nova Wings faces reckoning after passenger mistreatment. Policy changes announced." Another one scrolled across the morning news ticker. "Pregnant passenger refuses to sue, calls for mandatory empathy training instead." One hashtag trended across platforms within hours. "Dignity in silence." Some posts had screenshots of Zelina sitting calmly on the plane, taken by passengers during that tense exchange. Others shared clips of her speech at a COVID healthcare summit years ago, until now buried deep in archives. Her voice from that old video filled conference rooms, classrooms, and now the digital timelines of thousands who hadn't even known her name 24 hours ago. And yet, even as she sat by the window with the morning sun touching her cheek, Zelina didn't feel famous. She felt still, rooted, exactly where she was supposed to be. Meanwhile, in a training room on the ground floor of Nova Wings' Dallas headquarters, Lana sat in the back row. No uniform, no name tag, just her and a notepad she hadn't touched. The screen at the front played Zelina's old speech, her voice clear, strong, steady. Lana didn't fidget. She didn't whisper to the woman beside her. She just listened. And for the first time, the words weren't filtered through resentment or fear. They landed. When the lights came back on, Lana stayed seated a little longer than the others, head bowed, not in shame, but in recognition. She couldn't rewrite what she'd done, but she could choose what came next. Across the country, in a quieter corner of the Nova Wings operations office, Maribel Chen sat in her new office. On the glass wall beside her desk, a gold placard read, "Lead Service Manager, First Class Cabin Experience." It was more than a promotion. It was a quiet validation that stepping forward, just once, had changed the course of her own life. She typed an email before her shift began. "Dear Mrs. Moore, thank you, not just for what you said, but for how you carried yourself. You gave me courage I didn't know I had. I'll keep speaking up, not out of fear, but out of belief in what's right." Warm regards, Maribel Chenzelina didn't respond immediately. She smiled, saved the email in a folder labeled "To Remember," and placed it next to a digital copy of her baby's latest ultrasound. Two beating hearts, side by side. That evening, as her plane touched down at JFK, New York shimmered beneath her like a patchwork of chances and memories. And at the gate, standing tall in a dark coat and open arms, was Thane. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His hug was long, his breath slow against her hair, and Zelina allowed herself to exhale for the first time since yesterday. In the car, Thane handed her a folder. Inside were revised policy drafts, new employee curriculum, and signed approvals from 3 department heads. "We're rolling out full training system-wide," he said. "Every level, every region. This won't just be a fix, it'll be the standard." Zelina looked at him, her hand resting gently on his. "You're not doing this for me." He nodded. "I'm doing it for the woman who doesn't have your name, or your husband, but deserves every bit of the respect you were denied." That night, after dinner and soft music and the quiet rhythm of home returning, Zelina sat at her desk and opened a notebook. She began to write a letter to someone she hadn't met yet. "Dear little one, you'll grow up in a world that still struggles to see everyone the same way. But I promise I'll do something, no matter how small, each day to make it better for you. Not by shouting, not by demanding, but by standing, steady. Because dignity doesn't need volume, it needs endurance." She folded the letter and placed it into a cloth-bound journal. On the front cover, she scribbled a line. "They will remember me, not because I raised my voice, but because I didn't turn away." She placed the book in the drawer beside her bed. Outside, the city buzzed as it always had. But inside, something had changed. The story of a woman who boarded a plane to simply arrive had instead taken everyone else somewhere they didn't expect to go, with no turbulence, no crash, just the steady rise of a voice that never needed to shout. So what does dignity really look like? Maybe it's not loud, not dramatic, but steady, patient, and powerful enough to change an entire system. Zelina never raised her voice, yet everyone had to listen. Her story reminds us that silence isn't always surrender, and sometimes it's the strongest stand of all. What would you have done in her place? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful tales just like this.